In this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about drafting red, white in Duskmourn. I've done over 40 drafts on the way to Mythic rank, and I want to share that knowledge with you. I'll be going over game plan, card pick order, example decks, and extra tips to help you win more gems. Red white is focused around being aggressive. Specifically, you want to be going wide with multiple smaller creatures, and then closing out the game with something kind of hard for your opponent to handle. The two signpost cards are clear examples of this. They're both at their best with multiple small aggressive creatures and present ways to push through damage to close out the game. They also, for some reason, both gain quite a lot of life, which makes you more likely to win a race scenario where neither you or your opponent are blocking. Before I fully get into the card evaluations, I want to explain my method a little bit. I believe strongly that if you just put the best cards in your deck, you're going to get a lot of the way towards winning more. But once you've reached that point and you're looking for a bit more, you really need to know the purpose for every card and where it fits. To that end, I'll be sharing the 17lands.com data on each card, specifically the game in hand win rate, which is effectively how often you win when you have drawn that card. And I'll also be talking about wheeling. Wheeling or tabling is a term for Magic which describes when a card that you have already seen wheels around the table and comes back to you. For example, in your pack one pick one, maybe you see a few cards in one color, you pick one, and then you're fortunate enough that one of them also tables back around to you. That might be a signal that that color is open and that you want to continue drafting that. So an edge that you can get when drafting is knowing what other decks don't want, but your deck might, and then try and wheel those cards so that you get even more playables for your deck. I'll do my best to point out cards like that and also anything relevant from my own personal experience. So first we have Glimmerlight, a 2-cost artifact that makes a 1/1 enchantment creature when it comes in and can be equipped to pump a creature for 1/1. It's quite surprising that this is actually the highest win rate common for red-white, despite not being either color, but it just quietly does a lot of things. It will help enable delirium or eerie triggers if you happen to care about those. It is a body in itself, and it also helps your smaller creatures that are say 2/2s push through the other 2/2s and become 3/3s. This card is quite underdrafted for how much it wins and can even table as well. You probably don't need to pick it very highly, but you should probably be picking it higher than you are. Scorching Dragonfire, instant speed, exile removal that does 3 damage for 2. This is correctly picked quite highly and also wins a lot. Exiling is extremely relevant in this format, with Delirium being a common theme in many decks. There's also a few creatures with very nasty death triggers, and being instant speed is a huge upside. Unsettling Twins is a 2/2 for 4 that also manifests to create another 2/2. This doesn't look like a very aggressive card, but it does help with the plan of going wide by making 2 bodies, and sometimes Manifest can help you find something that you can flip up later or put something into the graveyard again if you care about Delirium. This is actually one of the best white commons overall, and is again probably a little bit underdrafted for how strong it is. Trapped in the Screen is great common removal. For 3 mana, you get to remove any artifact, creature, or enchantment your opponent controls until it leaves play, and it also has Ward 2. The Ward 2 is really important here. Although there's quite a few ways to deal with enchantments in the set, it's often not very cost efficient to try and manage this, and only in later games are you going to kind of feel the pain of the thing that you've exiled coming back. And since red-white is very aggro, often your opponent won't have time to actually do that. Turn Inside Out is a very interesting combat trick. For 1 mana you get to give a creature +3/+0, but also when it dies this turn you manifest. So most combat tricks don't give you this much card advantage, and so people's autopilot is to ignore them, and as such this card actually goes very late. But since it basically replaces itself and maybe even trades up on a card, it's actually extremely powerful, especially in aggro decks like red-white. So don't overlook this card when you're drafting. Clockwork Percussionist is a 1/1 for 1 with haste. It's also an artifact creature importantly, and when it dies you exile the top card of your library and you may cast it until the end of your next turn. People are gradually seeing how good this card is, but for a long time it's been undervalued, and I still don't think it's valued highly enough. In an aggressive deck it's great. You can be attacking on turn 1. It adds 2 types for Delirium if you care about that. It gives you card advantage if it dies. If you ever get to cast it, Turn Inside Out on this, you are loving life. I would happily play 4 or 5 of this card in my red-white deck. The last of the top commons is Glasswork Shattered Yard. For 3 you get to deal 4 damage to a creature, and for 5 you can be dealing 1 damage to your opponent at the end of each turn. Generally speaking you're going to want this for the first mode, but the opportunity to spend mana into this if you flood, or to have something to sacrifice to another effect, is great extra value. All these commons here are what I would call filler commons. You're happy to have them to fill out your curve, but you don't want to draft them too highly, and if you take too many of them your deck on average will be weaker. These commons are ones that you want to actively avoid in red-white. Either they are just bad cards in every deck, or they're just cards that maybe have a home, but that home is not red-white. One that I'd like to mention is Grand Entryway Elegant Rotunda. That card is probably not something you should be playing unless you care about eerie triggers, and generally speaking, red-white doesn't. So although it is an aggressive card that makes small bodies, it's just not enough value to justify being in this deck. Moving on to the top uncommons, we have Sheltered by Ghosts in first place. For 2 mana, it's an aura that will attach to one of your own creatures and then exile any non-land permanent that the opponent controls until it leaves play. It also gives that quick creature +1/+0, lifelink, and ward 2. This card is great in any white deck, but is especially good in red-white. That's because being able to deal with anything on the table for 2 mana is a huge tempo swing, and the ward 2 means that often the opponent can't take a turn off to deal with the creature you put this on. So either you can put it on something evasive and get in and gain more life, do more damage, or you can put it on something small and leave that at home, and the opponent can't take the time off to deal with it. Midnight Mayhem for 4 gets you 3 red gremlin tokens, and they have Menace, Lifelink, and Haste until the end of turn. This can just come out of nowhere and steal games and also stabilize you. It's very flexible, and that's before you even mention any of the other synergy cards like Arabella or other ones that we'll mention later on. The win rate on this is crazy for the fact that it's an uncommon. Because it's multicolored, it also goes quite late sometimes, but it has a higher win rate than many rares and mythics. Arabella is quite deceptively strong. For red and white, you have a 1/3 artifact creature, which when it attacks deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with 2 power or less. If this creature is attacking, you're winning. As such, you shouldn't worry about drafting multiples even though it's legendary, because if something happens, you can just cast another one. Painter Studio Deface Gallery for 3, you are able to exile the top 2 cards of your library and you can play them until the end of your next turn. And for 2, whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until the end of turn. Mainly what you care about here is Deface Gallery. You're going wide, and being able to sometimes double the power of the creatures that you're attacking with is a massive amount of value. And if you happen to flood out or you need to dig for something, then Painter Studio is very efficient card advantage for red. Optimistic Scavenger is a 1/1 for 1 that when you play an enchantment or unlock a room, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on any target creature. So if you need to make something bigger so that you can exercise it, that's also something to keep in mind. This is one of the best things you can be doing in the format on turn 1, and if you happen to get it early and start snowballing with it, then you will win in a lot of games. Despite red-white not caring as much about enchantments as say blue-white, it still has enough eerie triggers to make this card worth picking. Split Skin Doll is a 2/1 artifact creature for 2 that when it enters you can draw a card and then you discard a card unless you also control another creature with 2 power or less. So very often in this deck it is just draw a card. Being a very efficient 2-drop that may accidentally trigger Delirium or help you dig for things that you care about is great. Razorkin Hordecaller is a 4/4 with haste for 5 that whenever you attack with any creature, not just this one, you create a 1/1 gremlin token. So although red-white is aggressive and doesn't really want many cards that cost more than 4, this one is just very efficient for what it gives you. You might be able to steal the win with a big haste creature out of nowhere, or if you need to continue building up your army, then you can do that. Irreverent Gremlin is a 2/2 for 2 with Menace that whenever another creature you control with 2 power or less enters, you may discard a card, and then if you do, you draw a card. Do this only once each turn. Similarly to Split Skin Doll, this allows you to dig through your deck and is also relatively well statted for what it's costing. Efficient evasion on cheap creatures is quite rare, and as such you should be taking this card quite highly. Veteran Survivor is a 2/1 for 1 with a survival ability that lets you exile up to 1 target creature from any graveyard. As long as there are 3 or more cards exiled with it, it gets +3/+3 and has hexproof. So obviously a very efficient 1-drop, amazing if you get it right at the start of the game, but it also just randomly can hose Delirium and maybe just become a massive threat on its own. Piggy Bank is a 3/2 artifact creature for 2 that when it dies you create a treasure token. 3/2 is slightly above rate in comparison to most of the 2/2s going around. The extra types help with Delirium, and also getting a treasure token when it trades down can be helpful for ramping or just fixing. It doesn't look like it's much, but it's just above rate, and as such it has a good win rate. Glimmer Seeker is a 3/3 for 3 with survival. At the beginning of your second main phase you can make a glimmer token, and if you happen to have one then you draw a card. This just does a good job of, again, creating more bodies to go wide in the deck. It's relatively aggressively statted, and if you are already set up then you just start drawing cards. Exercise for 2, sorcery that exiles target artifact, enchantment, or creature with power 4 or greater. This is just a flexible removal spell. There's only so many things you can put in your deck that specifically target artifacts and enchantments. You really do want things that also hit creatures, and again exiling is very relevant in this format. Betrayer's Bargain for 2 is an instant that deals 5 damage to target creature, and if they would die, they're instead exiled. It has a split cost feature where it'll either cost 4 normally or 2 if you sacrifice a creature or enchantment. This is at its best in say red-black and even red-green. It's a little bit weaker in red-white, but it is still really good removal, and as such, you would take it anyway. Fear of Being Hunted is a 4/2 haste for 3 that must be blocked if able. If you ever get to just sneak 4 damage in with this and you feel great, but even if they're untapped, you're forcing them to block into your combat tricks, and giving you a little bit more control over how combat works before you actually swing is very helpful in planning what's going to happen. Fear of Burning Alive is an enchantment creature for 6. It's a 4/4 that when it enters the battlefield deals 4 to each opponent, and if you have Delirium, then normally it would just deal 4 to a target creature, but there are some shenanigans where it will trigger off other non-creature damage, or if you have multiples of them, they'll also trigger multiple times. 6 mana is a lot for a red-white deck, but the ability to just finish off a game without having to enter combat, or maybe kill off something bigger than you can normally deal with, is premium enough that this card has a good win rate. Conducted Machete is a 4-cost equipment that manifests dread and then equips itself to that creature, making a 4/3, and you can move it around for 4 mana. This is at first glance not very much a red-white card, it seems more like a grindy mid-range card, but being able to make your 1/1s and 2/2s big enough to push through a kind of board stall is a very helpful ability, and again, if you happen to care about Delirium or digging for specific creatures, then this is great. Last of the top uncommons is Surgical Suite Hospital Room. For 2 mana, you get to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield that has mana 3 or less. Or for 4 mana, whenever you attack, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. So often you would start this with Hospital Room in my mind and try growing creatures, and then you can, as the game goes on, potentially recur something annoying, ideally some annoying to block or evasive creature. And so although this looks a little bit slow, it actually does a lot of what the deck wants to be doing. These are the filler uncommons for red-white. As such, again, you'd be okay putting them in your deck, but you don't necessarily want to pick them too highly. A few of them are quite unique in their effects though, so Vengeful Possession is the only threatened style effect where you get to steal a creature temporarily for 1 turn in the set, and that is a great way to close out a game as a red aggressive deck. Norrin has some weird interactions. For example, with Arabella, whenever you attack, you get the trigger from her attacking, and then you can, if they block, recast her safely untapped again. So she basically becomes unkillable with Norrin in play. And Trial of Agony is extremely cheap conditional removal. If they have 2 big creatures and you're trying to close out the game, it's the best card for the job. But other times, if they have lots of small creatures, it can feel like a completely dead card. These are the uncommons I would generally avoid. Similar to the filler cards, maybe they're good in another deck, or maybe they're just bad cards. Untimely Malfunction is the only one here that I'd be okay running, but it really operates a lot better in different color combinations than red-white. Ideally, you want larger creatures to work with. Here are some example trophy decks, and you can kind of see the game plan coming together here. It's not particularly reliant on good rares. You can definitely just get this together with commons and uncommons, and you can see what we've talked about coming to fruition here with some of these lists. So finally, just some extra tips for you. Whilst red-white is very strong, it is known to be strong, and it is also quite heavily drafted. With that in mind, I definitely don't recommend forcing this archetype. In general, I would say what you want to do is be picking the strongest card for the first handful of pack 1 picks, and then near the end of that pack, or maybe early in pack 2, that's when you decide what lane you're in, what colors are open, and what you should be sticking with. Because there's a lot of common cards that are kind of filler and or you'd rather not be playing, it's important to try and find that open lane so that you can improve the quality of your deck. Try to be mindful of cards that might wheel. If you're looking at 2 cards that you'd be quite happy to pick, one is way more likely to wheel than the other, consider taking the one that you know won't wheel, and maybe you get fortunate and you get both of them at the end of the draft. Red-white is very aggro leaning. I haven't really seen functional versions of this color pair that go big and have lots of expensive creatures. So really try and play no more than 2 or 3 5+ cost cards in your deck if you can avoid it. And consider going down to say 15 or 16 lands if you actually have a very low average cost. If you found this video helpful, I've been making other limited videos and you can check them out here.